record because I see Toby and she was supposed to remind me. So now I remember. Okay, so we are recording. Okay, so here's the story. We are okay. Let me start this way. Does anybody have any questions on anything that's been going on? Things that have interested you? Things that you thought of? Toby, you have a question. Go ahead.
I'm confused about the riots or whatever they are and like the violence that's been going on.
Yeah, so unfortunately you just used the right word. Because it's like if we had this class yesterday, I would have said it's not violent, it's just protests. But unfortunately, last night they turned violent, which is something that really scares me, and I'll explain why. So in the beginning of Corona here in Israel, I'm talking about if we go back to March, we were like on top of the, like I said, literally on top of the world. It was amazing how well Israel handled it. Our numbers were down, our hospitals were fine, things were just great. They were like, I mean, there was Corona, you know, and then there were like the economy took a shot, but like the government stepped in and gave out some money, and and problems were handled as they came about. People were confident. People were worried, but they were confident. They kept to the rules. And what was amazing, absolutely amazing, was how well of a job Prime Minister Netanyahu did in terms of communicating with the people. It was absolutely incredible. Every single night, literally every night, at dinner time, he would host a press conference with the Minister of Health and the Director General of the Health Ministry, and he would address, okay, this is what's happening, this is what we're thinking of doing, and these are the possibilities. So by the time it happened, like if you said like we're going to close movie theaters, we're thinking about doing that tomorrow. So then you had 24 hours to think about, okay, I'm not going to be going to the movies. And then when he announced the policy, everybody was like, okay, I've thought that through. Yeah, I've been able to process it. Okay, kids aren't going to go to school. We got it, you know. And it was like, it was absolutely amazing. You know, you just had a feeling of confidence that Israel's really handling this well. Like this, it was just like, okay, we're in good hands. Our leadership is doing amazing. And then like it just got better because then our numbers completely went down. There were like times where we went like entire days without new Corona cases. Nobody was dying. It was just like, and I don't think Israel had a death that wasn't from that the person didn't have a condition beforehand. I think there was only like one young person that died. Everybody else was like over 70. It was just really incredible. And it was great. And we were like coasting, you know, like a few bumps in the road, but not many. Pesach, it turned out that like after all the leaders told us that we couldn't get together with our families on Pesach, and we all had like Sidarim at home alone. Even like old people had to have like Sidarim home alone. There was this picture of a Holocaust survivor who had like tons of family. Like she has tons of grandkids and she like making a Pesach Seder by herself for the first time since the Holocaust. You know, and like how sad of a picture that was. But everybody said, okay, but we're saving her life. You know, it's sad, but like we're all in this together. We're saving her. And then we found out like that the president of Israel's daughter joined him for Seder, and Prime Minister Netanyahu's son, who doesn't live with him, came to him for Seder. And that was like, people are like really ticked off about that. Like, why do we all miss our Sidar with our families? And you were able, but like other than that, like those small bumps, everything was great. And then about 3 weeks ago, everything went like straight down. Like everything just like, oh, it was horrible. Numbers started rising. People had no idea what they were supposed to do, if they were supposed to stay home or not stay home. People are not staying home. This is crazy. It's not going to happen. And then like numbers spiked like mad. And Prime Minister Netanyahu was nowhere. He didn't have any press conferences. He'd make these announcements. The Knesset would then say you don't have the authority to make the announcements. And then they would go back on their word. And then like Knesset members that had families that owned restaurants, like those restaurants were allowed to open. And like it was crazy. Like the whole thing was like they said like gyms and yeshivas can't open, and then like the Haredi parties went crazy that the yeshivas were closed. So they're like, okay, yeshivas can open, and then gyms were like, fine, we'll just teach Torah during the workout classes. Now we're a yeshiva, and then like gyms were open, and like the whole thing was like just, and then it's just going down and down and down, and like tons of people now have corona, and then the economy is like shot. Like something between 25 and 40% of Israelis are out of work. Like so that's really, you can handle a month of that if you think if you think something good's going to come out of it. But like but like when you're talking about now we're in like month 4 of people, so a lot of people, like the whole tourist industry is done for. There hasn't been a tourist in Israel in months. You were talking about like people are really starting to suffer, and Netanyahu's not giving press conferences, and no one trusts him. So then about I think it's 2 Saturday nights ago, when you have a demonstration in Israel, okay, so there's one place where like big demonstrations take place, and that's in what's called Kikar Rabin in Tel Aviv. It's a big open area. It's where Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. It used to be called Kikar Shalom, and then when he was assassinated, they changed the name. They named it after him. And that's where like big demonstrations take place. They take place on that Kikar, and like so they had like leading up to it a few demonstrations, but because of Corona, you couldn't have too many people, so they were always like 1,000 people, 2,000 people at most. That square can hold demonstrations, and it has of between 300,000 and 500,000 people at a time. Okay, that's what we're talking about, like what big demonstrations look like. And then 2 Saturday nights ago, there was this breakout demonstration of 10,000 people. So, and that was like, whoa, now we're seeing like there's a movement here. There are people that are very, very upset now. And they're upset. Also, keep in mind, Prime Minister Netanyahu is on trial for corruption, right? He's got 4 charges against him. So, and like more than half the country feels that he's guilty. Forget about a trial or anything. They just believe that he's guilty. So, so you're talking, people are sick and tired of Netanyahu. They're sick and tired of like this leadership, and they want him out. Now, it doesn't mean the whole country wants him out, but enough people want him out that they're making a lot of noise about it. And then they started, what's been happening over the last 2 weeks is the demonstrations moved to Jerusalem outside the prime minister's residence. And now what you have is you have people in Israel, you're allowed to demonstrate until 11 o'clock at night. You have a party till 11 o'clock at night. You can demonstrate till 11 o'clock. 11 o'clock's not lights out. That's curfew for everybody. Not like a real curfew. I don't mean like, you're not allowed out of your house. But like 11 o'clock, you better be, if the teenagers are making noise on someone's front lawn, you're allowed to call the cops at 11 o'clock, and then they come and tell you have to leave, okay? So 11 o'clock, so the police have been letting them till 1 in the morning, and they're like, they're like big protests. And then there was like women that were protesting, like in very odd ways, and there was like, there were like, things going on. And then last night, unfortunately, violence broke out, where pro-Netanyahu people came to the protests and stabbed 2 people and beat a bunch of people with like bottles and like bad stuff. It's really, really bad. And that happened last night. So now it's getting like really bad. Where this leads, I don't know.
I thought Israelis were smarter than Americans.
Generally we are, and you do see, by the way, like I don't think you'd ever get to a point in Israel where demonstrators would riot and loot. I think that goes against like everything we believe in. I don't think you'd ever see that, so that, but like the violence of Jew attacking Jew, especially, we're sitting here like Tisha B'Av in Israel is in a few hours from now. So the fact that like that Tisha B'Av is coming up, that's remember there was a message of when we didn't need divisiveness and we needed more unity, it's now, Yeah. So the fact that this is happening this week is mind-boggling. So, sorry.
When you said stabbing, it just sounds like a Palestinian or a terrorist or something, and it's so sad that it's a Jew stabbing another Jew.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. That's what scares me. I'm not that I would understand if a Palestinian was stabbing, but like we've been there before, I don't know. I can't remember in my lifetime of where Jews physically attack Jews over political differences. That I can't remember. You know, there's obviously Rabin's assassination, and there was the Altalena was a boat like in 1948. You know, it's a whole story there. But you know, but like this is something I you know, I just don't, you know, scary. Very, very scary. Yeah, so I don't know where it goes. I have to tell you, like I'm actually scared. Like I am scared for our people because I don't know. I don't think we have the leadership to bring us back. You know.
Well, if you're scared, then I'm very scared.
But I think it's justifiable. You know. So
Yeah.
yeah. But that's the story. So yeah, yeah. I don't know. I have to tell you, I'm generally a big Benjamin Netanyahu fan. I think that he's a force in Israel history. I think that he's been. I mean, he's just fact. He's been our longest serving prime minister, and generally, I think he's done amazing things for Israel and for the Jewish people. But the last couple weeks have been a huge disappointment in leadership. I just wrote a whole thing. You can see it. I put it on social media, but about the whole thing. I don't think he understands how to show empathy. Yeah, and all he needs to do is get up like he did the first couple of weeks, and just empathize with the people and say, "Hey, look, I get what's going on. I understand that you're struggling. I'm with you." You know, but it seems like he's incapable of doing that. In which case, the people are just going to get more and more divided, and I don't know. But that's what's happening day to day. Okay, any other questions? No? Okay. Okay, so let's get on to our topic here. And it's a good segue since we're talking about empathy and things. So a lot of times in Israel advocacy classes, they tell you all the reasons why Israel is right. And this is why Israel's argument is right. And you never hear the Palestinian side. You know? Now, I would love to bring one of my Palestinian friends on, and I find that when you have Palestinian speakers, they're generally divided into three types of Palestinian speakers that pro-Israel groups bring. If you're living in America and you go to an American university, so you're going to have the opportunity of hearing from Palestinian speakers, not brought in by pro-Israel groups. And if you live in Israel, so anytime you want, you can hear from Palestinians if you risk it. Yeah, but a lot of times when you have, let's say, like pro-Israel groups that bring in Palestinians, they're one of three types of Palestinians. One is the Zionist Palestinian. Okay, that's like the Palestinian that's like woken up and realized his people are wrong. Okay, you're not hearing from a Palestinian. I mean, the guy's a Palestinian, but you're not hearing from that's a joke. That's like saying you're hearing from an Israel speaker when the guy talks about how bad Israel is, right? That's clearly not representative of their people. Okay, so take all those people and throw them out. That's just a joke. I mean, they're great people and I like them, but you're not hearing from Palestinian when you hear from them. They're an interesting speaker. Okay, then you have a second type of Palestinian, which is a very enterprising Palestinian. What I mean by that is he's realized that he can make a lot of money speaking to Jews by only saying certain things. So he'll give a little of the Palestinian perspective, but not too much to really upset anybody in the crowd. You get a little upset because it's a little out of your comfort zone, but they're not going to really tell you what Palestinians are thinking. And those people, they speak a lot all over the place, and they get paid a lot of money to speak, and they make a living off of it. And I have nothing against them. They've realized that we've got suckers amongst our people who really want to hear from Palestinians, and it makes them feel good when they hear from Palestinians, and just as long as they don't upset you enough, and they found that sweet spot, where they'll say very nice things about the state of Israel. Oh, they've done great things for us. But if you'd walk into a Palestinian village, you would never hear anything that this person is saying. Like, you're not going to find one person that thinks this way. This guy's got like their canned speech. Okay, so those two types of people, which are easy to bring on and get to speak, I think are absolutely pointless to hear from. There's just no reason. It doesn't help you. The Palestinian that hates me and thinks that this country is evil, if I brought them on as a speaker, I'd get fired. Okay, you can't bring a Palestinian that's going to tell you that Israel is horrible, that Bibi Netanyahu is a war criminal, that the IDF is a Nazi, army, and you can't have that in front of a Jewish group of students because you'll start crying. It's the first time you'll hear this, and you'll go to your parents, and you're gonna have nightmares. Like, and I'm serious, you'll be like, oh my God, like they'll start making a lot of them make up stories, or they're true stories that unfortunately happen. And you're like, oh my gosh, like everything I know in my world is all shaken up. It's imagine it's similar if somebody would walk into your house and tell you, by the way, your parents are bank robbers. I just want you to know that you think they're going out for their normal job every day, but they don't have a normal job. They rob banks and they do really bad things when they rob the banks. Okay, so you'd be like, your whole world would be shaken up. So that doesn't work. Now I have to tell you, if you really, and this is not for when you're in high school, but when you get older, if you really want to understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you cannot understand it unless you spend significant amounts of time with the third group, the real Palestinians. Okay, and I mean like going to their villages and going to their houses. I taught this conflict for 10 years before I really understood it. Before I started going to Palestinian villages when I moved here, listening to Palestinians, have Palestinians tell me to my face that I'm a horrible person, that I'm a war criminal, that I'm a Nazi. Until I sat there and heard those words being thrown at me and seen the Palestinian experience, I couldn't really understand the conflict. I understood one side of the conflict, not the other. What I want to do in the next, 20, 30 minutes is, to the best of my ability, convey to you what that third group feels in a way that won't make you feel like, oh my God, what in the world is happening, okay? Now, I want you to know, I've spent quality time with Palestinians. I've studied their side of the arguments. I've listened to them, and I still came out pro-Israel. So I don't think that they're correct. I also think it's important that, and this is a personal goal of mine, is that we should have peace in this land. That we should have peace. Like one day, hopefully we'll have peace. But we're never gonna have peace in this land. We'll never achieve that if we don't know what the other side is thinking. Right? Everybody gets that? Right? You can't. Right? You can't know. You have to reach out. You have to talk to them. Okay? So I think it's important for us to understand what the other side is thinking. Okay. Okay. So that's the story. Okay. Okay. So let's go through what the other side claims and thinks. Okay. First and foremost, okay, they do not see at all that there's any justification or any side of the argument that says that Jews and Israelis and Zionists have a right to be here. Everything we talked about the last 2 weeks about the right to be here, they don't agree to. They do not think that that's true. Okay, so they don't think that Jews have a right to be in Israel. Everybody get that? That's the starting point off. Okay, now to the extent that many will deny fundamental historic facts that the entire world agrees to. Okay, and I'll give you a fascinating example of Palestinian rejectionism to the extent of absurdity. Okay, in the 2000 Camp David Accords, that's like Ehud Barak was the Prime Minister of Israel, Bill Clinton was the President of the United States, and Yasser Arafat was the was the head of the Palestinians, and all three of them got together at the president of the United States' retreat in Maryland called Camp David to try to hash out a final status agreement and a peace deal. Okay. One of the conditions was that the Temple Mount and the Western Wall should be accessible to all three religions. Okay. Now, who is going to control it was a matter for negotiation. But one of the things that Bill Clinton wanted to make sure was that Jews, Christians, and Muslims would all have access to that site. And Yasser Arafat was having none of it. He said, we're going to control the Temple Mount, and no Jew is going to go up there. So President Clinton said to him, listen, I understand it's your holy site, but other people also consider it their holy site. The Jews' temple, both temples were there. And Yasser Arafat turned to him and said, no, they weren't. Now, I mean, Hodiah's father literally for a living proves that they were there. But like, to be able to say to anyone in the world that the temples never stood is ludicrous. To say this in a serious conversation is really incredibly dumb. But to go ahead and, as the leader of the Palestinian people, turn to the President of the United States of America, a highly intelligent person who has studied just the basics of history before stepping into the room, and tell them that a fact that the entire world agrees to is untrue is crazy, okay? So that's the first thing. Now, Yasser Arafat's an intelligent person, but let's imagine if you could create a system where information didn't flow freely, where you could look stuff up, right? Your teacher tells you something, and you're like, I don't know if that's true. You could Google it. Imagine if you didn't have that power. Imagine if you didn't have that opportunity. Imagine if you were like, you could control a society to the extent where the more information stems from teachers, parents, and community and religious leaders. That's where you get your information from. You don't double check. You don't have access to the internet. It's not something that you look at all the time. And you're taught from a very young age that the entire world is trying to convince you that what you believe is not true, so you have to not believe them. So if you're told from a very young age that the Jews are imposters, and there's no Beis HaMikdash, right? And there's no Beis HaMikdash, like there was no such thing as a temple, a Jewish temple on the Temple Mount. So you have no reason to doubt that. You're not going to doubt that. You're not going to think that that's not true. And you're going to grow up thinking that the Jews are colonialist imposters. Everybody get that? Okay, so that's where most of Palestinian society rests. Whether it's to their own fault and how you blame ignorance, not the point. Most of them feel that Jews have no right to be here. Okay, everybody got it? Okay, so that's the starting point. Okay, they do not believe that Jews have historical rights to be here. If you do convince somebody, let's say you have somebody with, let's say, a university education, and they have to admit to the fact that Jews once lived here, so their answer is, well, a lot of people lived in this land. Romans lived here, the Greeks lived here, Persians lived here, Babylonians lived here, many different groups of people lived here. Okay, so one of them was the Jews as well. But just like a guy in Italy is not going to say because the Romans lived here, so they have the rights to come back, the same way the Jews don't have a right to say that they're going to come back. The Jews are white Europeans. They do not have a right to be here. Everybody got it? Okay, yeah, Rebecca.
So then what do you say, what do you say to the person that says, like, oh, so why don't the Romans come and, like, take back the land or something?
So the Romans never claimed that this was their land, right? Just to answer the question quickly, right? No Romans admitted that they invaded the land. We are saying that we're indigenous to this land, we're native to this land. It's a big difference in the arguments, right? So the Palestinians say that we weren't native to the land, we're not indigenous to this land, and we were here like any other people were here, so we don't really have a claim to the land. Adding on to that Arabs have been here most Arabs have only been here for about 200 or 300 years, but there are Arab families that have been here 700-800 years, okay? So adding on to that, right, so now you're talking about there are Arabs that say we've been on this land for hundreds upon hundreds of years, okay? So, right, how are you going to tell us that we don't belong here? This is our land as well. Okay, so that's the second step of their claim, that not only do Jews not have a right to the land, but this is actually Arab land. This land has been Palestine for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and therefore that's what this land should remain, from the river to the sea. Okay, everybody got it? Okay, so that's like those are the starting fundamental points. Now let's imagine we were in a Palestinian classroom now, and we'd be discussing how was it that the state of Israel came about, right? How did all of a sudden the state of Israel come about if there was no such thing as a state of Israel, right? We're all in agreement the last 2,000 years there was no state of Israel. So how did it happen in 1948? All of a sudden there was a state of Israel, okay? And this is what they're going to explain. They're going to say that in the early 1900s, Jews felt a ton of persecution in Europe. All true, right? There were pogroms in Europe in the early 1900s. They sensed Nazi Germany coming to power, okay? And so therefore they started realizing that Europe was no longer going to be hospitable to them. And they looked around for a place where they could go. And not that they had any connection to the land, but they created a colonialist ideal where white people get to come into whatever land they want and take it over from the natives. And they chose Palestine. They chose Palestine because it was weak, right? It wasn't heavily built up. Nobody was investing in it. And they decided that they're going to move to Palestine. The fact that there were Arabs living there, the colonialists, like all colonialists, didn't care, okay? Then they started moving in there in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and all of a sudden, World War I breaks out, and the Ottomans, who were in control, lost control, and the British, more colonialists came in, and they took over, and they allowed the Jews to move in at the expense of the Arab landowners, okay? And all of a sudden, more and more Jews started coming in, which was unfair. Those were colonialist settlers that were coming in. Okay, today, nowadays, especially with progressives taking over a large part of the conversation, the word colonial is like the equivalent of Nazi. Okay, that's what colonial means. It means people that don't care about others, right? Like the colonies, the American colonies, right? So America rebelled against the colonies and created an America. That's what they view the British and the Jews as doing. They're right about the British, but the Jews, we know we were coming home, not that we were trying to take over somebody else's home. Okay, everybody understand? Okay, good. So now the Jews start moving in. They start taking over land that they shouldn't have taken over, and that's what now starts happening more and more. Then all of a sudden, the Nazis come to power. And the world should have stopped the Nazis. And they didn't. And because they didn't stop the Nazis, millions of people, including millions of Jews, died in World War II. And the world was responsible for that. Not just the Germans, but the world. Not just the Nazis, the world. Because America sat by while it happened. England sat by while it happened. All these countries sat by. And at the end of World War II, they looked around, and there were a ton of Jewish refugees. There were about 1 million, maybe 2 million Jewish refugees that had nowhere to go. And the world had pangs of guilt over the fact that they had not stopped the Holocaust from happening. So what did they decide to do? They decided to give the Jews their own land and give them Palestine, but at the expense of the people living there. And this was a great catastrophe, and that's what they call this. They call it the Nakba, okay, where the world decided to split up Palestine into two countries, and that was the Nakba. That was a great catastrophe where the land was robbed out of the Palestinians' hands. Okay, and then the Jews came in and they controlled it. They threw out close to 1 million Arabs from their land, forced them into other countries to become refugees, right? Never to be able to return to their land till today. And then they started mistreating the Arabs. In 1967, Israel started another war. They don't look at it as, like we know that war was defensive. They look at it as an offensive war. And Israel did it to take over more and more land. So they took over the West Bank and they took over Gaza. And now Israel had more control over Arabs, and they decided to subjugate these Arabs and treat them as second-class people, create an occupation over their land, and not allow Palestinians the right to self-determination and freedom that every other people in the world deserves. And to this day, Israel occupies, mistreats, abuses, and does not give Palestinians the right of self-determination on their own land, and Israel illegally occupies Palestinian land. That's the Palestinian argument in a nutshell. Okay? Now, we could deconstruct it and show where it's wrong and everything else. Okay? I want to give you guys, I'm gonna literally step away from the screen. I'm gonna do an exercise. I'm gonna step away from the screen because I'm gonna give you about like maybe 2 to 3 minutes. I want you to really process that information that I just told you. Okay? So I'm gonna literally step away, come back in about 2 or 3 minutes, and I want to see if you guys will have questions after thinking for a couple of minutes and letting that sink in. Okay. Any thoughts pop up? Rebecca?
Three things. One is that like they say that like the Jews came before like the Nazis even like started like the Holocaust, but wasn't it that like they all came after?
No, so like about 200,000 Jews came before the Holocaust.
Okay, and also what's it called? Like if I was also taught this, I would also like hate Israelis.
Yeah, for sure. Right. It's yeah, right. Of course, if this was fact, then it makes Israel look very, very bad. Yeah.
Yeah, Rabbi, where does it end? If this is a religious issue with them, it's not like you're changing their minds in any way. Giving them their own land wouldn't even help if they believe that all the Jews need to be expelled from the land. So, where are they going to? Where does this end?
I have no idea where it ends, and it's funny because I mean, not really funny. It's sort of like sad, tragic. I think is the word. But whenever like people say to me, "Hey, like you're against the two-state solution. You're against the one-state solution. So what's your solution?" So I always say something that shocks most people, especially people that work a lot on this. I don't have a solution. And they say like, "What you have to have a solution." So I'm like, no. You see, like we're so used to, and I think it actually comes from television, right? What's the worst thing that you could see at the end of a television show?
A bad ending.
Nope, worse than a bad ending. It would disturb you more. What, Rebecca?
No ending.
Well, you can't. I mean, you can't have no. The show ends. I mean, it's not like it keeps going.
A cliffhanger.
What?
A cliffhanger.
Not a cliffhanger. The 3 words. To be continued.
That's a cliff.
That's the worst. You're like, what? No, come on. No, don't do that to me. Don't make me wait a week to find out what happens now. I want to know now. Give me now, right? I 22 minutes to tell me a good story, and it was supposed to end in 22 minutes, right? For those of you that just binge watch shows, so you have no idea what's so bad about To Be Continued because it just keeps going. But if you ever watched a show that only shows up once a week, and you're watching it like as it goes on, To Be Continued is like you want to murder the writers. and like because you're like you failed. You had 22 minutes to tell me a story, and I want a quick solution. That's not how things work out here, right? Arabs, first of all, think in 1,000-year spurts. Okay, if you talk to an Arab, especially Persians, that's why Persians created the game chess, right? Because they're thinking steps ahead, and there's no rush. There's absolutely no rush. You could have a strategy that takes 1,000 years to come to fruition, and Arabs are perfectly fine with that. Even if the first 999 years are going to be horrible for them, as long as somewhere down the line there is a solution, they're fine with that. So when you talk to Arabs, right, Rafi says, well, how does this end? So if you talk to Arabs, it ends with Israel being destroyed. So like, look, Israel's a very successful country. It's got the world's 8th most powerful military. You guys essentially have like AK-47s. You don't own a tank. How do you exactly see this ending with Israel's destruction? You'll be like, well, it might not be this year, might not be this century, might only be next century. But eventually, all other people that have come into this land have left and disappeared. That's what will happen to the Jews as well. It's so that's how they view it. So yeah, so I don't remember which Israeli prime minister it was, but there was an Israeli prime minister that said you can boil down the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to one sentence. The Palestinians want the Jews out of Israel, and the Jews don't want to go.
Wow.
Right? That's the whole thing. That's the whole ballgame. So where do you find a compromise in that? Like there was a great comic that came out that was very anti-President Obama comic, but there was the Iranians at one table, and clearly like it was the president jumping from table to table between the Israelis and the Iranians, and the Iranians had demanded, like the president's holding a piece of paper with the Iranian demands, and one of them is like all Jews die, and the President Obama was talking to, like, it's a comic, right? He's talking to Bibi Netanyahu, and he's saying, well, could you maybe meet them halfway? So that was like, that's the idea. It's just not gonna, it doesn't work this way. So one of the two sides has to change their way of thinking. And since their education is, putting them in their way of thinking, and our education is putting us in our way of thinking, nothing's gonna change. Well, Diane, you had a question?
About what you said that Jews came to Israel because of the Holocaust.
No, I said some Jews.
No, yeah.
That's what their claim is. That's why the world gave the Jews Israel.
Okay, because I finished a month ago a book, and it's all about Eliyahu Hakim and Eliyahu Betzuri. When they were fighting, they were in Israel, and they were hung because they were fighting for Israel before 1948. So
right.
Jews were here, and they were fighting for Israel before.
Yes, 100%. The Zionist movement started in the late 1800s, but that's the Palestinian narrative, right? By the way, what I don't think we'll get to it in this class, but that's why there's so much Holocaust rejectionism inside Palestinian and Arab society. Because if you can convince the world that the Holocaust never happened, or at least make it a doubt, and then you convince the world that Israel was created because of the Holocaust, then there's really no justification for Israel anymore. So, the old president of Iran used to go around saying the Holocaust never happened, and people used to say, like, not only are you stupid, like, what do you expect to get out of this? And he understood that if you tell a lie enough times, people begin to believe it. So it might not happen in his lifetime, but eventually people will. And if you can convince people that the state of Israel was only founded because of the Holocaust, and then you tell people there was no Holocaust, then there's no reason to have a state of Israel. And you can justifiably get rid of the state of Israel. That's why that line of reasoning is so prevalent among Arabs, especially those that fight against Israel. Okay, so that's the Arab perspective. Okay, so that's where the Arabs come from. Now, there's another side to the Arab perspective. Let's move forward in terms of how do they use these arguments in terms of their advocacy today. Okay, so if Israel has no right to be in control of this land, so then what you have is without Israel having control, like a right to control the land, then the very fact that we are here is illegal, is immoral. So just us being here, even if we treated everybody kindly and even if we gave equal right, it's not ours to control, right? That's the next step, okay? So Israel itself is a criminal entity and has no right to exist. Everybody got it? That's their next step, okay? Especially in the areas where the United Nations has designated as a Palestinian state, meaning what the world calls the West Bank and what we call Judea and Samaria. In that case, Israel is violating international law. The international community, except for the United States and a few other countries, but just about everybody in the international community considers Israel's occupation of the West Bank to be illegal, to be violating a war crime. That's the next problem, okay? That's then adding on to the next problem after that, right, is the fact that we've moved our own people like myself who live here, we've moved our own people into the settlements, right, into these areas and settled land that's not ours. So not only do we control land that's not ours, we've then put our own people on that land. And now we are living and have stolen land from Palestinians, okay? So when people talk to me that are either anti-Israel or don't know enough, okay? So they tell me the fact that I have my house built where it's built means that I'm a criminal, right? I'm a criminal. I have stolen the same way anybody else goes to somebody else's yard. Imagine if you had a very large property and somebody built their house on your property, you'd look at them and you'd be like, what are you doing, right? And let's imagine that it takes a couple of years for the courts to come up with a decision. Every single day you see this person living in their house on your land, you're going to say, you can't be here, right? Get out, right? And if the person just sits there and says, I've got all the power, right? Look, here's my gun, get me out of here, right? So then you're not going to be able to. You're going to look at this person as somebody who's illegal and doing something illegal. That's how the Palestinians view the settlers. Now let's go one step further. Now the question is, if Israel controls this land, how do they deal with the Palestinians that are in this land? So the Palestinians that are in the West Bank. And what they contend is, and it's incredible to me, because it's so easy to knock this down, right? I have this conversation 10 to 15 times a week with people. People say that Israel violates, in the way they govern, they violate the human rights of the Palestinians. Palestinians' human rights are violated, okay? I had a conversation with somebody last week who wrote a huge op-ed, okay, that was massively published, and wrote in this op-ed that the Palestinian human rights are being trampled on by Israel. And I asked him one very simple question. Name one. Name one human right that Israel's denying Palestinians. You can't, because there are none. So there's this image out there that Palestinians are suffering, that they're losing the human rights because of Israel. And it's very simple. Name a human right. Now, they might name things, but they're not human rights. They're naming things that are bad for the Palestinians. They'll say, Palestinians lived in abject poverty. Whether it's true or not true is not the point, because that's not a human rights violation. Okay. Now, Palestinians have no vote. They have no freedom of speech. That's not from Israel. That's from the Palestinian Authority. Okay? So that's something else completely. Okay? So that's the next thing. Rebecca.
I thought that Arabs weren't allowed to vote because or else they would take over the government.
No. Arabs, there are two types of Arabs between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. There are Arabs that are Israeli citizens. Okay, they live in mainland Israel. That's 20% of Israel's population are Arab citizens of Israel, and they have every single right I have. There is no difference between me and them. Okay, absolutely none. They serve in the Knesset, they get everything. Okay, then there are Palestinian Arabs who live in what the world calls the West Bank. We call Judea and Samaria. They do not have Israeli citizenship because they don't live in Israel. Okay, like we discussed last week, this is not part of Israel, and they've opted for a process that will give them their own state, but have not come to negotiate that state with Israel. So on the one hand, they demand, we want our own state. We will not become your citizens because we want our own state. On the other hand, when Bibi Netanyahu says, okay, come, let's discuss, or I'll go to you, they say, no, we're not talking. Right? So that's the breakdown. So they don't have citizenship because for those reasons I just listed. Okay? So, but there's two types of Arabs. You can't conflate the two because they're completely two different types of Arabs. Okay, that's true of until today. What's going to happen this year, next year? Who knows what goes on after that? Okay, but that's the idea. So the next level of arguments are, that's what that is the I'm trying to think of how to say it. That's what's been going. That's the next level of charge, is that Israel treats Palestinians unfairly. Okay, now if you come out here and you would go around with Palestinians, you would see two things. You would see some Palestinians who are multimillionaires and enjoying life, and you'd see some Palestinians suffering. Literally like every other society in the world. You could do that in Florida. You could do that in New York. You could do that in Paris, in Moscow. You could do that anywhere, right? There are always going to be wealthy people. The poverty levels amongst the Palestinian people and the Israeli people are within 2 and 3 percentage points of each other, okay? So they are not suffering any more than Israelis are suffering. There is a poverty problem, 100%. It hovers around 27%, okay? But that is true of both Israel and the Palestinians. If Israel's poverty level was somewhere around 8 or 9%, and the Palestinians was at 27%, then you'd say, oh, that's not fair. There's an inequality there, and something has to happen to change that. That is not true. That's not what's happening. The poverty levels are the same. Okay, Rafi?
You're talking about the poverty levels of the people living in Israel or the people living in the West Bank?
Both. That's what I'm saying. In other words, the poverty levels are the same in both areas.
Among Arabs living both in Israel and in the West Bank, those are the same too?
Jews, everybody. Okay, that's the overall poverty level is the same all across the board. Again, it's like 2 or 3 percentage points different, but that's the thing. So if somebody wanted to show you a video of poor Palestinians, you'd be able to find it. You could take a video of a wealthy area in Israel and say, look how well the Jews live, and then go to a poor area in the Palestinians and say, look how bad they're doing, right? You'd be able to, right? You'd be able to show that. Then they take things like checkpoints, okay? And we don't have time to go through what each checkpoint is now, and they'll say, look how bad Palestinians have to go through checkpoints. It's so bad, right? So these are policies that Israel has that are justifiable, and again, are not human rights violations. If you would go to the International Criminal Court and say, hey, is it a human rights violation for Israel to set up checkpoints? They're going to say, no, that's not a human rights violation. That's not illegal. They're allowed to do that, okay? So that's the difference. So those are the arguments that essentially you're going to hear. So I'm just going to review them, and then if you have any questions, I'll take them, and if not, then we'll end, okay? So here's the, and I'm pretty sure this is our last class. Maybe we take a break for a couple weeks, and then we start up again in September. But let's review what we've said so far, okay? There are essentially 4 arguments that the Palestinians use and center around. The foundational one, we have no right to be here, right? This is Arab land, okay? The second is that in 1948, a great travesty was perpetrated onto the Palestinians, the Nakba. Nakba is Arabic for catastrophe, okay? They commemorate the Nakba every year, the same day we commemorate Israel Independence Day, right? So part of society is celebrating like crazy, and part of society here is commemorating a tragedy. Okay, it's an amazing dichotomy of what goes on. again, between the river and the sea here. Okay. Then you have the third level is that Israel's taking over of the West Bank of Judea and Samaria was also illegal. Its continuous presence in the West Bank is as an occupying force and is illegal. And the fact that they brought in settlers is even more illegal. Their last argument is that the way Israel governs the Palestinian Authority is a violation of human rights and is oppressive to the Palestinians. Okay? Everybody got it? Okay. Any questions?
Wait, you said for the next class, I thought it was like, it's not next week.
I thought this was the last one. Are there classes scheduled for more?
It's August 5th and 12th.
Oh, there are 2 more classes?
Yeah.
Okay, so then I guess we have 2 more classes. Okay, there you go. Okay, great. Good to know. Okay. 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 So that's that. By the way, Shlomi had written in the chat here about something called Dir Yassin. So you're going to also have different historical points and different episodes that the Arabs are going to use to say, okay, look, this bad thing happened and that bad thing happened, and each one of those has to be answered. We have to answer each of them. Right now is not the time. We don't have time to go through each of them. But as you begin to study this more and more, and as you're exposed to more and more things, you're going to hear accusations against Israel. Some of them, by the way, can be true, right? Some of them can be true. Just like a checkpoint is justifiable for Israel, but stinks for a Palestinian. I'll give you one last thing to think about before we end, okay? How many people here have, in the last 2 years, flown on an airplane? Okay, every one of you has flown on an airplane in the last 2 years. You have all gone through security, right? I can almost guarantee you, unless you were going, I don't know, on a trip to a funeral or something, that the highlight of your trip was not the security check, was not taking off your shoes, was not taking off your belt, was not, taking out your laptop and, unpacking every single thing that you packed and answering all the questions and going through. That is never the highlight of anyone's trip, right? But no one walks out of there and says, human rights violation, TSA, human rights violation, right? That person touched me. And that's allowed because there's a recognized security need. And you say, okay, these people are the security professionals. Their job is to ensure that that we're all secure. So that's allowed. What ends up happening is that when Israel takes those measures, those are seen by the world and the Palestinians as oppressive and illegal measures against the Palestinians. Now, I have to tell you, I want you to picture a nightmare scenario where imagine we were not Jews living in Israel, but we were Jews living in a Palestinian-controlled Palestine. Okay, imagine if history had flipped its head, okay, and the Palestinians were in charge, and we felt this was our land. And imagine if, once a week, Jews were given a permit to go visit the Western Wall. So once a week, you had the opportunity, if you passed certain security screenings and the Palestinians felt that you were okay, you were allowed to go to the Western Wall once a week. In order to go to the Western Wall, you had to have your permit, and you had to go, and you went through 4 or 5 checks, even though you're a good person, and you had to get checked, and you couldn't go on Tuesdays, and you couldn't go on Wednesdays, let's say Shabbat was not the day. They say they only allow Jews to go on Thursdays, okay? So Tuesday, you want to go to the Kotel, you can't go, because the Palestinians say no, okay? And every time you go through a security check, in what you consider your own land, you have to go past a Palestinian soldier with the Palestinian flag hung, and there's Palestinian flags hanging everywhere. And when you go to the Kotel, you have to go past Palestinian security officials, and you're like, this is my land. You should not be here. That's what every Palestinian feels all the time. It's important that you feel that. Not just know it, but feel it. If you don't feel that frustration and that anger, you can't really understand the conflict. Right? It's a whole different perspective, putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Again, I'm not saying we're not justified. I believe that every single thing we do is justified. But I also recognize how frustrating it is for my Palestinian neighbors. It's a very important point to realize, okay? It's empathizing with other people's feelings, okay? And recognizing that although I might feel that whatever's happening to them it should happen to them, or at least is justifiable that it's happening to them, at the same time, I recognize that I wouldn't want to feel the way they're feeling, okay? Now, Israel does, one last thing, there's one of the checkpoints into Jerusalem is called Calandia, okay? And that used to be a horrible checkpoint. It used to be about 40,000 people all going through the checkpoint every single morning. And in order to go through the checkpoint and get through by 6 a.m., you had to get online by 3 a.m. And they were crowded in, okay? It was horrible. You look at pictures online and you're just like, we should not be treating people this way. But we couldn't figure out another way of doing it until somebody came up with a system where the permits that the Arabs would get to cross into Israel would be biometric, and they could use like a sort of like a subway style like card that passes through, and they're able to go through. And Israel instituted that. Today there's 30 kiosks, and you don't have that situation anymore, okay? Because Israel said, yes, this is bad. There's no reason why it has to be this bad for them, right? There's going to obviously be delays, but it doesn't have to be like it was. So that's okay. Now we're able to make the situation better. Now, I'm a big proponent of making the situation as good as we possibly can for the Palestinians, as long as it's not at the expense of our security. I see no reason to make Palestinians feel bad, or not. I want to create a place where Palestinians want to be citizens of Israel, much like Israeli Arabs. If you give them, if you take a poll among Israeli Arabs, the 20% of Israeli Arabs that are citizens of Israel, and ask them, would you rather join and become a citizen of the Palestinian state or remain an Israeli citizen, the levels are like something above 90% want to remain Israeli, okay? Because they understand that that's a blessing, the freedom that Israel provides them, and they're not going to have the same treatment under the Palestinians. Okay, everybody got it? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, have a great week. I hope that Tisha B'Av is not. Look, we're coming out to the final hour, so it's hard to believe that this is not going to be another day of tragedy and commemoration, and Mashiach's going to come. But have faith; you never know. But I hope that you have an easy fast, and then great comfort in the week after Tisha B'Av. Okay, I will see you guys next week.
So, bro, the Mashiach will come to America.
Thank you.
He'll forget you guys.
All right. Bye, guys.